Speaking of difficult interviews and handling difficult interviewees, one thing that can make an interview difficult is when a source asks to go off the record. First of all, you have to know what off the record means on deep background. So let's go over those terms. Here's the chart from your textbook that shows this information. Of course, on the record is what we want. You can use it, you can identify the source, you can run actual quotes. It's a real normal interview situation. Off the record is in some ways the most restrictive, but the simplest of these kind of agreements. You can't use the information. You can't identify the source. You can't run quotes. Off the record information has to be confirmed from someone else. It may sound like it's not worth having. It can still be very useful. With off the record information, you know something, so you know what you're looking for. You know what kind of documents you might try to seek to get it. You know the other people who might know it. Knowing it, you can ask your questions differently. So it's still very useful. On background and on deep background are dangerous situations. You should be very careful with these. On background essentially means that you are using the information, running quotes, but not naming the person. You have some agreed upon other way of identifying them vaguely. Okay, this isn't the same thing as changing someone's name or hiding someone's identity. That's kind of an even different situation. And then on deep background is very uncommonly done in normal reporting. It's really an inside the beltway Congress and White House situation. You can use the information. In fact, it's very manipulative. This situation asks you to use the information as if it's fact. Just write it. Just say it. You can't say anything about the reporting. You can't run the quotes because it's not quotes. It's just fact. You can't identify the source in any way, right? So it's unattributed speculation, perhaps. I think the only reason you can really get away with this is if it's true factual information that's got an incredibly high news value, maybe about public safety or something like that. So now that you know those terms, off the record, on the record, background, I want you to forget about them. Don't forget about them for the quiz, but forget about using them. Instead, if you have a source who's getting squeamish about their identity being used, you need to have a full conversation with them about what's the problem, how can you convince them to change their mind and go fully on the record, and if you can't, instead of using those terms, map out exactly what it's okay to do, what is okay for you, what is okay for them. Maybe portions of the conversation can be used as a normal interview and portions won't be. So get specific and go through it point by point. You want everybody to know really what's going on. And remember, many news organizations will require you to get an editor's permission before using sources who are on background, or especially sources with whom you've changed or hidden their identity in any way, unnamed sources. So this whole territory may have to involve an editor also. In fact, you may have to tell the editor who your source is, depending on what your news organization's policy is. More and more news organizations have cracked down on the use of background and hidden identities because of high-profile cases of fabrication. So make sure you know what your news organization's policies are, and make sure you have a good working relationship with your editor so you can work that out. Speaking of off the record, here's something that can really ruin your day as a reporter. Imagine you've done all your preparation, you got to your interview, and you had a great interview, and everything worked out fine. And then at the very end of it, you're packing up, you're saying goodbye, and the source says, "Oh, by the way, you're not going to use any of this, are you? This is all off the record. We were just talking." Sounds fanciful, but it happens. What are you going to do? Well, first of all, did you identify yourself properly as a reporter and explain that you were writing a story? You should always start that way, probably with the initial conversation, and then even later when you're making the formal introduction of yourself. "Hi, I'm a reporter for such and such, or I'm a student journalist, or I'm working on a story about something or other. So make it clear. That'll prevent confusion later. But surprisingly, there will be people with whom you've made that clear, and you've taken notes through the entire interview, and still they will be surprised that their comments might be used in a story. I don't understand it, but it happens. Well, one thing you got to think about is, who is this person? Are they what I would call a civilian, or are they a professional? In other words, are they somebody who has not dealt with the media before, or someone who has dealt with the media regularly? Was it the mayor? Was it a college official? Was it a board member or somebody else who has been in the media regularly, who has talked to reporters before? If they didn't arrange to be off the record at the beginning of the conversation, then forget it. You can't let them pull that kind of stuff at the end after they've already spoken. They should know better, and you shouldn't let them get away with it. However, is this, on the other hand, somebody who's never spoken with a reporter before? Or maybe it was a phone interview, right, with somebody who I would call a civilian, and they didn't really understand what was going on. It wasn't clear to them. There's a possibility that there was confusion, or maybe it wasn't a phone interview. Could they have just thought you're having a conversation? You aren't required to abandon the interview or give in to them. But if they're a civilian, especially somebody who's not very sophisticated and has never dealt with the media before, I think you're under an ethical obligation to do everything you can to make them feel comfortable with the situation. Maybe that goes as far as abandoning the interview, but it needn't go that far. You can probably talk through it with them, explain everything. Maybe you have to redo the interview. Now they understand that it's really for publication in some way, right? So I think you need to go the extra mile with civilians. So let's imagine another problem that can develop late in the process, and this is the last one for this video. You've done the interview, everything worked out great, you got through all your problems, you've written a story, it's all done, maybe it's even all edited, it'll be published soon, and you get a phone call from your source, and they say, hey, send me a copy of that, I want to see that before it's published. Well, they're going to see it soon anyway, right? So what's the problem? Why don't you just throw it in an email and send it to them? Well, there's a big problem with this. Giving a source a story, giving anybody actually a story before publication is very problematic. When you give somebody a story in this way, they're almost certainly going to want to make changes. They're going to want to have influence. And you might say, well, they're the source. What's wrong with that? They're important to the story. Yes, but you are not writing the story for them. We don't write for our sources. We don't write to please our sources. We write our stories for our readers. And the source's motivation, even in a relatively mild story without a lot of controversy, the source's motivation can be very different than what your reader's motivation would be, and what your principles are also. So, and by the way, there's a newer version of this that's been happening the last few years, when so many news organizations, even small daily newspapers, have been publishing much, if not maybe all their content, much more quickly online, long before it's published in print. So what happens in that case is the early version of the story goes up online. Maybe you're still working and reworking it, and that's when you get the call from the source saying, "Hey, I did just read it, all right, and now I want to make some changes." Now, let's imagine the first situation. It hasn't gone online yet, hasn't been published in any way. You may talk to them about what it was what the interview was about. Especially, you may talk to them about factual points. Especially if they're concerned that you might have a factual point wrong, you may review that point. I wouldn't even go so far as to review their quotes with them. No, I wouldn't do that. But I would talk to them about, in general, remind them what it was you talked about and what it was that you took notes on, but not with specifics. And then you could go over factual points, because you definitely wouldn't want to get any facts wrong. And in the more modern situation where it's already actually it's been published online, but it's not been published in print yet. It's not its final version. Well, they've already seen it. What kind of changes are they trying to make? In either case, can you let them make changes and the reason why we don't give them advanced copy is we don't want you to make changes just to make themselves look better, just because they think they want to sound different, right? they don't like the way they sounded, too bad. That's what they said. That was the honest, your honest interpretation of what happened at that moment during the interview. And we don't recraft things for their, to make them look better. So factual changes, that's different, but we don't make changes just on a whim. In fact, if you start giving stories to people before they're published, not only are they going to try to change the things that they said and change the way they look and sound, they're going to start trying to change other parts of the story too. And remember, you're not writing for them, you're writing for the reader. Okay, that's about all that I had to say about interviewing. I hope this has been helpful, informative, including the other little videos that have been in there. And I expect there will be some questions on this topic on the test, the quiz that we have on the 22nd. I'm including perhaps some extra credit questions on this topic. So look over the handout about the information I wanted you to get from this series of videos. And have a great break.